The galaxy had rules. Most species learned them fast because the ones who did not learn them fast did not survive long enough to regret it. Rule 1. The Drakvori were old. Rule 2. The Drakvori were powerful. Rule 3, and this was the one every human worker on Sovereign Station memorized before their boots hit the docking floor: you did not look at a hatchling when it was being corrected. You found a wall. You found your boots. You found anything else in the room that was not the hatchling and the elder standing over it. You kept your eyes there, and you waited for it to be over. Ren Aldrich had been on the station for 2 years. He knew the rule. He looked anyway. The hatchling's name was Sara. Ren had seen her before. She moved through the lower research corridors sometimes, quiet and quick, with that particular stillness that young Drakvori had when they were thinking hard about something and trying not to show it. She was smaller than the older hatchlings. Her scales were a deep gray-green that caught the station's artificial light in a way that was almost blue in the right corridor. She had been walking past the human work bay when she stopped, apparently by accident, to watch Ren recalibrate a pressure seal on an extraction valve. He had been humming to himself, which he did when he worked, and she had tilted her head at the sound the way a person does when they hear something they cannot quite name. That was all it had been. Sovereign Drath had been passing through the same corridor with his full attendant line, and he had seen it. The discipline was formal. That was the thing that made it harder to watch, not easier. There was no shouting. Drath did not strike her. He simply stopped walking, turned to look at Sara, and spoke in the low register that Elder Drakvori used for formal address, a sound that sat somewhere between a rumble and a vibration, felt in the chest as much as heard. He spoke for about 40 seconds. The other hatchlings in Drath's attendant line went completely still. The human workers nearby found their walls and their boots. Sara lowered her head to the correct angle, held it there, and did not move. When Drath finished, he walked on. His attendants followed. The corridor returned to its normal hum. Sara stood where she was for a moment. Then she began to walk in the opposite direction. Ren watched her go. He did not know why he hadn't looked away. He was not brave, particularly. He was an engineer from a low-orbit mining colony who had come to Sovereign Station because the pay was good, and he had no particular reason to be anywhere else. He had no politics, no mission, no great cause. He simply could not make himself look at the wall when something that was clearly capable of being ashamed was being made to feel it in public. It seemed dishonest. Not to her, she didn't know he was there, or so he thought, but to himself. Before she turned the corner, Sara glanced back. Not at the corridor, at Ren. He gave her a small nod, nothing more. The kind of nod that means, I saw, that's all, just I saw. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she was gone. Director Vale found Ren that evening in the human workers' common area and sat down across from him without asking. Vale was sharp in the way that senior liaison officers became sharp. Not from wisdom exactly, but from understanding precisely how much trouble any given situation could create and being permanently calibrated against it. "You filed a welfare complaint," she said. "I did. About a Drakvori hatchling. About a Drakvori hatchling being publicly humiliated in front of her entire attendant line for stopping to listen to someone hum." Vale was quiet for a moment. "Ren, the complaint system exists so that human workers have a channel for concerns about their own conditions. It does not exist for this. It says sentient welfare in the header. It says a lot of things in the header." "I'm aware." Vale leaned forward. She was not unkind. That was the difficulty of Vale. She was genuinely not unkind, which made disagreeing with her feel strange, like arguing with someone who was clearly trying to help you and simply had a different definition of what help meant. "I'm going to bury this one," she said. "For your sake, don't file another." Ren said nothing. Vale took his silence for agreement because it was easier. She left. Ren sat with his tea until it was cold. 3 days later, a message came through on his equipment bay reader during a routine maintenance shift. It was embedded in a standard calibration log, which meant it had come through the general maintenance data feed rather than the human communication system. It was not in any format that a standard message should be in. It was a data chip, slim and dark, slipped behind the secondary pressure coupling on his workstation panel. He almost missed it. He did not miss it. He took it out and held it in his palm for a moment. It was Drakvorian make. He could tell by the density and the particular texture of the casing, which was designed for claws rather than fingers. He had to use a tool to open the read port. Inside was a single file. The file contained a single line, translated into human standard in the particular careful way that meant the translator had worked very hard and was not entirely sure they had it right. It read, "Why did you not look away?" Ren read it twice. He set it down on the workstation. He looked at the wall for a while, thinking. Then he picked up a stylus and a scrap of physical paper from the recycling tray at the base of his kit bag, the kind of paper nobody used anymore because everything was digital and monitored and logged, and he wrote 4 words, folded it, and slid it back behind the secondary pressure coupling. Then he went back to work. Somewhere on the other side of the station, in a corridor that smelled of mineral coolant and old alloy, Sovereign Drath stood in a quiet room reviewing security footage from the past week. He moved through it methodically, as he moved through everything, with patience, with attention, and with the particular calm of something very old that had long ago stopped being surprised by the galaxy. He stopped at one frame, a human worker unremarkable at a workstation, a hatchling in the corridor behind him, barely in the edge of the frame, tilting her head at a sound. He watched it 4 times. He made a note to have the human brought to him for a formal review. He was not yet concerned. He was simply curious. In 3,000 years, very little had made Drath genuinely curious. It was not an unpleasant feeling. It was, if anything, familiar in the way that old warnings were familiar, felt in the bone before the mind caught up with the meaning. He closed the file. The station turned through its slow orbit. The stars outside did not change. And in a maintenance corridor on the lower level, behind a secondary pressure coupling that no one ever checked, a folded scrap of paper waited to be found. There were 47 maintenance logs sent through the general data feed every day on Sovereign Station. Nobody read them. That was the point of maintenance logs. They existed to be filed, sorted, archived, and quietly ignored by every automated system that received them. They were the background noise of a working station, as invisible as the hum of the ventilation or the low vibration of the orbital thrusters keeping everything steady above the gas giant below. Sora had been trained to identify background noise and discard it. She had been trained to allocate attention correctly, to spend focus on things that mattered and filter out things that did not. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She was currently very bad at ignoring maintenance log 7 Delta 9. The file itself was ordinary. Pressure calibration readings on the lower extraction bays, submitted by engineer R. Aldrich, human, unremarkable, routine, formatted exactly as it should be. Except that embedded in the secondary data line in a compression layer that was not part of the standard log format was a very small audio file. And in that audio file was a man's voice, calm and unhurried, reading 4 words from a piece of paper. Because it mattered, things that matter deserve a witness. Sora listened to it 9 times in one sitting. Then she sat in the dark of her quarters for a long while, thinking about those words in the way you think about something when you don't have the right category for it yet, and your mind keeps turning it over, trying to find where it fits. It did not fit anywhere she already had. That was the beginning. What followed was slow and careful on both sides. Ren was cautious by nature, not fearful, but precise. He was the kind of person who did not say more than was needed, and who understood intuitively that the value of what he and Sora were building was entirely dependent on no one noticing it was being built. He used physical paper for short exchanges and the audio compression layer in routine logs for longer ones, always buried under genuine calibration data. He sent them irregularly, not on a schedule, which made them harder to pattern match. He had no particular training in this kind of thing. He was just an engineer who understood how systems worked, and systems worked the same way whether you were talking about pressure valves or surveillance networks. They were built to catch the things they were told to expect, and they missed the things no one thought to look for. Sara, for her part, was fast. She learned the method within 3 exchanges and began improving on it, using her own access to the station's technical infrastructure to create additional quiet channels in places that only a hatchling familiar with Drakvori system architecture would know to look. She was careful too. Careful in the way that someone is careful when they are doing something they cannot fully explain, even to themselves, but which feels too important to stop. The questions she sent him were extraordinary. Not because they were complex, because they were so simple, and yet no one had ever asked them to him before in that exact way. What is it like to have no bond? He thought about this for a long time before he answered. He sent back, quiet, sometimes too quiet. You build your own reasons for things. Nobody tells you what to care about, so you have to figure it out, and sometimes you get it wrong and there's nobody to blame but yourself. It's harder, but when you care about something, it's yours, all of it. Nobody gave it to you. Do humans feel fear? Yes, all the time. We just keep going anyway. I don't know if that's brave or just stubborn, probably both. Why do humans grieve so loudly when their kind die? He sat with this one for 2 days, then, because we don't live very long. A human life is maybe 80 years if nothing goes wrong, and things go wrong often. So every person you lose a lot. You lose all the time you would have had. You lose the person you were becoming around them. Humans grieve loudly because we think if we're quiet about it, something important will disappear and nobody will know it was ever there. Sara read this one in the utility corridor outside the deep power relays, where no one came unless there was a fault alarm, and she read it 3 times and felt something shift in her chest that she had no name for. It was not the bond. She knew what the bond felt like. It was always there, a low, warm hum that carried Drath's steadiness and occasional distant displeasure like a frequency she had lived inside her whole life. This was something else. Something that came from the inside out, rather than the outside in. She did not tell anyone about it. But Koru noticed. Koru was the senior hatchling in Drath's line, older than Sara by several years, larger, and deeply committed to the order of things in the way that some people are committed to it not because they have thought about it and chosen it, but because the order of things has always been good to them personally, and they have never had reason to look closely at why. He was not cruel. He was simply certain, and certainty in someone with his position and size could look very similar to cruelty from a distance. He came to Sara in the training wing on the 4th week and told her that her attention patterns had changed. He said it without accusation. He presented it as data, the way Drath would, because Koru modeled himself on Drath in everything. But Sara heard the warning underneath. She told him she was studying human technical documents to better understand the extraction system she managed. It was even partially true. Koru looked at her for a long moment. Drath has noticed, he said, not the documents, you. He waited to see if that landed. It landed. He walked away. That night, Drath increased surveillance on the lower maintenance levels. Ren's workstation was scanned twice in 48 hours. Nothing was found because there was nothing to find by the time the scans ran. Sara had built the channels well. But Ren noticed the scans, because engineers notice when systems behave differently from how they behaved yesterday, and he went quiet for 6 days. The silence was worse than the surveillance. Sara found herself returning to the quiet channel and finding nothing there, and feeling the absence in a way that surprised her. She had not realized until it stopped how much she had been looking forward to the next message. In the middle of the 6th day, Davin slipped into the utility corridor while Sora was running a check on the power relay housings. Davin was the youngest of Drath's hatchlings after Sora, quiet in a different way than she was, where she was quiet because she was thinking. He was quiet because he was watching. He watched everything. He had always watched everything, and nobody had ever paid much attention to that because he was very good at seeming like he was watching nothing in particular. He crouched down next to her, looked at the relay housing she was checking, and said in a low voice, "I found one of the papers." She did not move. She kept her hands on the relay housing. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." He was quiet for a moment. "I put it back." She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was still looking at the relay housing, as if they were simply two hatchlings doing routine checks together. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a little longer than felt comfortable. Then, "I'm still thinking about that part." He stood up, ran a brief check on the panel above the relay, marked it as nominal in the log, and walked away. Sora stayed where she was for a moment, then she went back to work. Meanwhile, Director Vale found Ren for the second time in as many months and told him with more firmness than before that the increased surveillance in his section was not coincidental, and that whatever he was doing or not doing, he should strongly consider being visibly and obviously doing nothing for the foreseeable future. Ren thanked her for telling him. He meant it genuinely. Vale left, again taking his silence as agreement. On the seventh day, a maintenance log came through, routine, formatted correctly, calibration data on the lower extraction bays. But in the secondary compression layer, very small, was a voice. Calm, unhurried. "Still here, just being quiet for a while. That's allowed too." Sora listened to it once. She did not need to listen again. The freighter was called the Gorev's Promise, which was either a hopeful name or an ironic one, depending on how the next 48 hours went. It had been impounded at Dock 7 on a routine cargo inspection that turned out to be not so routine when the inspection team found, in a sealed secondary hold under 3 layers of legitimate freight, 11 canisters of restricted biological samples, fragments of Drakvori scale tissue and bone composite, which were classified as sovereign biological material, and were therefore not the kind of thing you could legally transport in a human freighter's secondary hold without a permit that essentially did not exist. The crew had 11 people. One of them was named Greer, who was Ren Aldrich's old mining partner from a colony job 8 years prior, and who had apparently decided somewhere along the way that the legitimate cargo business was less interesting than the other kind. Under Drakvori law, the penalty for transporting sovereign biological material without authorization was destruction of the vessel and full detention of all crew pending elder review. This was not unusual. The Drakvori had been running the same law for centuries, and it had an extremely effective deterrence record, mostly because the cases where it was applied were not publicized outside the station where they happened. The crews knew. The carriers knew. Most people in the outer transit lanes knew. Greer, apparently, had known, and made a calculation that did not go the way he had hoped. Ren heard about it the same way he heard about everything on the station, through the engineering data network, which carried all kinds of information in its background traffic if you knew how to read it. He sat with the information for about an hour. Then he went to Director Vale. Vale had the look of someone who had already seen the detention notice, already run the math on what she could do about it, and had already arrived at an answer she did not like. "I know why you're here," she said. "The Compact of Presence," Ren said. "Article 14, Clause 7. A human citizen in detention under Drakvori jurisdiction has the right to formal representation before an Elder Council session if the penalty being applied exceeds detainment beyond 30 standard days. Destruction of vessel qualifies." Vale stared at him. "That clause hasn't been invoked in 30 years. It hasn't expired." "Ren, nobody invokes Article 14. It exists the same way a lot of things exist in interspecies compacts. It was written in the good faith period, and everyone has quietly agreed to pretend it's decorative since then. Then it'll be an interesting session, Ren said. Can you get me a formal audience request filed? Vale looked at him for a long time. She was doing the calculation again, he could tell, running the outcomes, weighing the trouble it would cost against the trouble it might prevent, trying to find the version of this where she could be helpful to Ren without making everything significantly worse for everyone. She was thorough, Vale. He had always respected that about her. I'll file it, she said at last. But when this goes badly, I want it on record that I told you it would. On record, he agreed. The council session was held in the main formal chamber on the station's upper level, a room designed specifically to make the people inside it feel the appropriate weight of the institution they were standing in. The ceiling was high. The light was a cold, deep blue-white, the kind of light that did not flatter anyone. The elder panel sat on a raised tier at the far end, which meant that everyone who addressed them did so from a position roughly a full meter below, which was intentional. Drath sat in the center. He had two advisors flanking him, and Koru standing at attention to his right in the hatchling attendant position. Sora was in the gallery above. She had found a reason to be there, a routine technical audit that required her to access the chamber's environmental systems during the session window. It was a slim excuse, but a real one, and Drakvori administrative process valued real reasons, even slim ones. She stood at the back of the gallery where the light was low and the angle was sharp, and she watched. Ren came into the chamber alone. No advocate, no team. He was wearing his standard engineer's uniform, which had not been replaced in a while, and showed it, and he was carrying a single data tablet with the relevant compact articles loaded and ready. He walked to the speaking position below the elder tier and stood there, and the chamber was very quiet. Drath looked at him. You are the human who filed the compact invocation. I am. You are filing on behalf of 11 humans detained for transport of restricted sovereign biological material. I am. You understand the nature of the material and the severity of the violation. I do. There was a pause. Drath's expression was difficult to read, which was normal. Drakvori elders had faces built for scale displaying rather than the small muscle movements that humans used for expression. So to a human eye they often appeared simply still, which was not the same thing as blank. But Sora, who had spent her life reading the small signals that others missed, could see that Drath was paying a specific kind of attention to this man. The kind he paid to things that were not yet fully categorized. Ren spoke. He made the legal case first because leaving it out would have been a mistake. The compact language was real and it had to be real to matter, so he walked through it carefully, clause by clause, without hurrying. The council advisors shifted. One of them leaned to Drath and spoke quietly. Drath did not look at them. Then Ren stopped making the legal case. He looked up at Drath directly and said, I want to say something else if that's permitted. Drath gave a minimal gesture that meant proceed. 11 people are going to lose their ship and their freedom because one of them made a bad decision. The other 10 made the same decision that people make when they take a job on a freighter with a captain they trust. They showed up for work. I'm not saying the violation wasn't real. I'm saying that destroying a ship and detaining 11 people is going to be remembered. It will be in the freight networks and the transit records, and in the way human carriers talk about this station for the next 50 years. He paused for one breath. Mercy will be remembered differently. That's all I wanted to say. Nobody spoke. The chamber was quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of an audience waiting for something, but the quiet of one. Koru's jaw was set. He was looking at Ren with a hard, flat expression that Sora recognized. It was the expression he used when something had happened that he had not anticipated, and he had not yet decided what to do with it. Drath was still watching Ren. He was still doing the categorizing thing. Sora could see it, the small stillness around his eyes that meant he was filing and sorting and thinking in the deep way he thought, when something did not fit his existing understanding of how things were. He gave his ruling in 4 sentences. Vessel impounded, not destroyed. Crew detained for standard review period, not indefinitely. Material confiscated and returned to sovereign custody. Case closed. His advisors were silent. Koru looked at the floor. One of the other council members started to say something and then stopped. Drath adjourned the session and walked out. His attendant line followed. In the gallery, Sora stayed where she was for a moment after the chamber began to clear. Below, Ren was gathering his tablet and turning toward the exit. He moved the same way he always moved, without ceremony, without performance. He had said what needed to be said, and now he was going back to work. That was all. She had spent weeks reading his messages and thinking she understood what he was. She realized, watching him cross that chamber floor, that she had understood the words but not yet the full shape of the thing. He had stood in front of one of the most powerful creatures alive, and he had refused to make himself small. He had done it for 11 people, one of whom was a friend, and the other 10 of whom were strangers. He had done it with a data tablet and 4 years of reading small print compact articles in his spare time, and something that she was only now finding a word for. He believed it mattered. He simply believed it, the way some creatures believe in gravity or atmosphere, not because someone told them to, but because the evidence of their whole life had made it impossible to believe otherwise. Something in Sora's chest shifted. Not the bond was still there, steady and familiar, a frequency she lived inside. This was below the bond, or maybe beside it, something that had been growing quietly for weeks and had just reached a size she could no longer pretend was small. That evening she sent him a message, not a question this time. A statement. I think I understand now what you meant about things that deserve a witness. Ren read it at his workstation, read it again, and sat for a while looking at the words. Then he turned back to his pressure calibrations, and for the first time in a while, he hummed while he worked. In a quiet room on the upper level, Drath reviewed the day's records. He read the compact invocation filing. He read his own ruling. He sat with it for a while, the way very old things sit with information they do not yet know what to do with. He had no answer for why he had ruled the way he ruled. He had several logical explanations, and none of them felt complete. He set the file aside and looked at the stars through the observation port above his desk. They did not have answers either, but they had been out there longer than any of this, and somehow they continued regardless. He found that, for once, he took something like comfort in that. The data did not make sense, and the research team knew it. They had been running biometric wellness checks on all hatchlings aboard Sovereign Station for the past 2 months. A standard practice, nothing unusual, the kind of routine monitoring that the station's medical division performed quarterly to ensure that the bond lines were stable and hatchlings were functioning within normal parameters. The bond was not fragile. It had never been fragile. In 3,000 years of Drakvori records, it had proven to be one of the most stable biological neural structures known to exist. It maintained under stress, under illness, under grief, under combat. It had never shown measurable structural change after initial formation. Sora's bond signature was changing, not breaking. The lead researcher checked this 6 times before he allowed himself to write it in his report, because the distinction was critical. The bond to Sovereign Drath was intact. Every verification protocol confirmed it. The signal was there, the reciprocal frequency was functioning. There was no evidence of rupture or decay. But the signature itself, the unique pattern that identified which hatchling was bonded to which elder, and which was as fixed and permanent as a physical structure, had drifted. The angles were different. The resonance weight had shifted. Something in the deep biological layer of the bond had quietly reoriented. The way a river changes course slowly over years, not breaking its banks, but no longer running the same line it once did. There was no record of this ever happening before. The researchers searched archives going back 800 years. Nothing. The phenomenon, as far as Drakvori science was concerned, did not exist. The report went directly to Drath. He read it alone in his private records room, in the part of the station that no attendants entered without being summoned. It took him a long time. He was thorough, the way he was thorough about everything, which meant he read the technical sections carefully, then reread them, then pulled the underlying data directly from the medical archives and reviewed it himself rather than trusting the summary. He was the kind of authority that had remained authority for 3,000 years, partly because he never assumed that someone else's reading of evidence was sufficient when he could read the evidence himself. When he was done, he sat for a while in the quiet. Then he called Sora. She came to his private chamber the way she always came, promptly, correctly positioned with her head at the appropriate angle. She was good at the forms. She had always been good at the forms, which was part of why Koru's report about her changed behavior had initially seemed like over-calibration on his part. Looking at her now, Drath could not see the change. But the data was in front of him, and he had verified it himself. He placed the data on the surface between them without preamble. He presented it the way he presented everything, as information, not accusation. He walked through the measurements, the comparisons to baseline, the archive searches. He was precise and unhurried. Then he stopped and waited. Sora looked at the data for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "I don't know what is happening to me," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said in a formal setting in weeks, maybe ever, and the honesty of it was visible. It sat differently in the room than a rehearsed answer would have. "But I don't believe it is wrong." Drath was quiet for a long time. The thing that Sora could not see and could not be expected to see was that those 12 words had unsettled him more than any of the data had. He had expected denial. He had expected confusion or fear. He had not expected calm. He had not expected a hatchling to look at evidence of something unprecedented happening inside her own biology and say, with full knowledge of what it might mean, that she did not believe it was wrong. That required a foundation. And foundations did not appear from nothing. He dismissed her without a ruling. He needed to think. Koru did not need to think. He came to Drath within the day, formally, in the correct request posture, and presented a case for removing the human engineer from the station. He was organized. He had the contact logs that surveillance had pulled, the pattern data on Sora's changed behavior, the timeline showing the correlation between the human's presence and the onset of detectable irregularities. He argued it calmly, methodically, and well. Drath told him he would consider the request. Director Vale, who had been monitoring the situation through channels that she maintained specifically so that she would never be surprised by anything on the station, told Ren the same evening that a formal removal order was being processed. She told him with a kind of tired clarity, not angry, not relieved, just honest. "I told you," she said. "I told you twice." "You did," Ren said. "The order will be final in 4 days. Start packing." Ren did not start packing. He sat in the maintenance corridor where he had worked for 2 years, and he thought about Sora, who had sent him a statement instead of a question, and had not sent anything since. And he thought about what it meant that something unprecedented was apparently happening to her, and everyone's first instinct was to remove the nearest human. Davin found him there at the end of the maintenance shift. He sat down on the floor beside him, which was unusual. Davin was not typically a person who sat on floors. He looked straight ahead at the corridor wall. "The medical data went to Sovereign Drath this morning," he said. Ren waited. "Her bond signature has changed. They have no record of it ever happening before." Davin paused. "Koru wants her rebonded. There's a theoretical procedure, resets the bond architecture back to its original structure. It has never been done. It exists only in the oldest technical archives, from a time when the bonding system was still being developed." Ren said, "Would it hurt her?" Davin was quiet for a moment. Yes. They sat with that for a while. Why are you telling me? Ren asked. Davin was quiet again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like someone who was saying a thing that had been sitting inside them for a while and had not yet fully become words. Because when I found that paper, I read it, and then I read it 2 more times, and I have been thinking about it since then. And I thought, he stopped, started again. I thought someone should know who would care. Ren looked at him. Davin was still staring at the wall. What do you want me to do? Ren asked. I don't know, Davin said. I just thought someone should know. He stood up, he walked away. Ren requested a private meeting with Sovereign Drath the next morning, invoking the compact clause for the second time in a month. Drath granted it. Ren suspected he granted it for the same reason Drath had seemed to study him during the council session, not because he thought it would be useful, but because he had not yet finished categorizing Ren Aldrich, and unfinished categories bothered him. The meeting was private and short. Ren did not argue for Sora's case directly. He talked instead about human biology, about how humans were fundamentally social bonding creatures, how their brain chemistry was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of interdependence, how contact with another being who genuinely treated you as real and worthwhile had measurable physical effects on neural architecture. He cited studies. He was an engineer, not a biologist, but he had read the studies because he had found them interesting once, and they had stayed with him. Then carefully he said, I think Sora has not broken. I think she has expanded. Whatever the bond is made of, whatever the biological structure is, I think it encountered something her whole architecture was built to respond to, and it responded. That's not damage, that's function. Drath did not answer. He sat with it the way he had sat with the data, thoroughly, in the deep way. Then he ended the meeting. He did not revoke the removal order, but he did not finalize it either. That night Sora was placed in medical confinement for observation. She was told it was standard protocol. She did not argue. She understood, with the clarity that had been building in her for weeks, that arguing was not the right move here, that the right move was to wait, and to use the waiting well. She asked for access to the historical archives. The request was granted. Nobody had thought to restrict it. She settled into the small room with the data terminal and began to read. She started with Drakvori medical history, then Bond biology, then social history, then the oldest records she could access, the deep archives, the ones that predated most of the current administrative frameworks, the ones that nobody read because everything relevant had long ago been summarized in the current reference documents. She read for 6 days. And on the 6th day, she found something. In the oldest section of the bond biology records, before the current bonding system had been standardized, there was a single notation that had never made it into any of the summaries. It was unremarkable in appearance. A few paragraphs, dry and technical, describing the biological conditions under which the protobond structure showed orientation drift in early research subjects. The condition was described as sustained exposure to a secondary social bond formed through genuine reciprocal regard. In the plain language at the bottom of the notation, a researcher had written. In the careful handwriting of someone making a note, they expected other researchers to read. Recommend study of whether protobond drift represents failure or adaptation. This question was not resolved before program standardization. The program had been standardized. The question had not been answered. It had simply been left behind. Sora read it 3 times. Then she set the terminal aside and lay in the quiet of the confinement room and looked at the ceiling. 3,000 years, and in the beginning someone had already wondered. 6 days alone in a small room with the oldest records in the Drakvori archive system was not a punishment. It did not feel like freedom either. It felt like what it actually was, a suspended moment, a place outside the normal movement of things, where a person who had been running on instinct and quiet urgency could finally stop moving and read. Sora read everything. She started with the bond biology, as she had planned, and found the notation that had changed the shape of her understanding. Then she kept reading. She read the history of the bonding system's development, the early decades when it was still theoretical, the period of testing, the formal implementation that followed a political crisis she had been taught about only in its broad outline. She read the crisis itself in its original records, not the summaries that appeared in the standard historical curriculum. It was different in the original, more complicated. The bonding system had not been created to serve hatchlings. It had been created to prevent another conflict like the one that had nearly fractured the Drakvori Empire 2,800 years ago, a war in which hatchlings, free to form their own allegiances, had divided and chosen sides and made the conflict longer and worse. The bond was designed to eliminate that possibility, not designed for the hatchlings, designed around them. The distinction was significant. She sat with that for a day. Then she kept reading. She read about every hatchling in the recorded history, their names, their bonds, their records of service, the brief notations at the end of each entry that marked their death and the closing of their bond line. They lived shorter lives than the elders. They always had. The records did not comment on this. It was simply there in the numbers if you looked. On the fourth day, she asked for communication access through the station's official channel, the formal one, monitored, logged, requiring Drath's authorization. The request sat for 4 hours. Then it was approved. Drath was watching. She had expected that. She used the channel to connect to Ren's workstation terminal. He answered from his own terminal, slightly out of frame the way he always was on video calls, because he was not someone who thought about where he was sitting relative to the camera. He looked at her, and something in his face settled in the way that faces settle when you have been worried about something, and then the thing appears and is still itself. "You look like you've been reading," he said. "I have," she said. "For 6 days. I need to tell you what I found." She told him. All of it, the original notation, the unanswered question, the real history of how the bond system was built, and why, the numbers in the mortality records that nobody discussed. She told it the way she had learned to tell things from reading his messages, directly, without softening, because she had found that the truth at full weight was more bearable than a reduced version of it, because at least then you knew what you were actually holding. Ren listened the whole way through without interrupting. This was something she had come to trust about him, the listening. He listened to the whole thing before he said anything, and what he said was always about what she had actually said rather than about what he had been preparing to say while she was talking. "That sounds like something they probably hoped no one would ever look up," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." She paused. "I'm going to tell the others." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's your choice to make. I'll be here either way." She held that with her after the connection closed. "I'll be here either way." Not, "I'll support you if you're right." Not, "I'll be here if it goes well." Either way. It was the kind of statement that required a long record of being present without conditions, and he had that record. She had read his messages for months. She knew his record. Drath, watching the feed from his private terminal, closed it when the call ended. He remained in the quiet of his room for a longer time than he had spent in quiet recently. He was not a person who avoided thinking about difficult things. He had become what he was by consistently thinking about difficult things longer and more honestly than most creatures could tolerate. But this was different, because what Sora had told the human was true. He knew it was true because he was old enough to remember when some of it was still contested history rather than resolved record. He had been alive during the tail end of the standardization period. Not as an active participant, he had been young then, by elder standards, but alive. He knew the real reason the bond system had been formalized. He had known for a long time. He had not, until now, considered what it would mean if a hatchling knew too. Koru came to him on the 5th day with the formal rebonding request. He had built the case carefully, organized it well, included the medical data and Sora's changed behavior patterns and the precedent argument from the oldest theoretical archives. He was thorough. He was convinced. He stood in the correct posture and presented his case with the particular energy of someone who believes they are defending something genuinely important, which he was, from his perspective. The order of things was genuinely important to Karu. It always had been. Drath listened to all of it. Then he said he would review the request. Karu left. He had expected an answer. The non-answer bothered him in the specific way that non-answers bother people who are certain. It felt like a gap where certainty should be, and Karu did not tolerate gaps well. Davin had spent the week being careful and quiet in his particular way. He had not gone to Drath. He had not gone to Karu. He had done something that took longer to organize and required more patience than either of those things would have. He had found 7 other hatchlings across the station, in 7 different bond lines, and in the course of perfectly ordinary maintenance and administrative tasks, he had passed each of them a small piece of physical paper. The papers contained in condensed form what Sora had found, the original notation, the unanswered question, the real history. He had learned the method of physical papers from months of watching Ren Aldrich. He had never directly told Ren that he was watching and learning. He thought, maybe, that Ren had suspected it. Ren was the kind of person who noticed things and said nothing about them until saying something was useful. On the 6th day, Drath called a full Elder Council session. He presented Sora's medical data. He presented the research team's findings. He presented the fact of the theoretical rebonding procedure and its hypothetical application to Sora's case. He presented everything fully and correctly because he did not operate any other way. The council's response was fast and loud. It was loud in the specific way that institutions become loud when they encounter something that their frameworks cannot process cleanly, not deliberate, but reflexive, the noise of systems encountering a situation they were not designed for and running their existing responses at full volume because there was nothing else in the library to run. They argued for precedent protection, for the integrity of the bond system, for the danger of allowing a documented case of bond drift to exist without corrective action, because if it existed without correction, it became a known possibility, and known possibilities were different from theoretical ones. The vote was called. The council voted to authorize the rebonding procedure, 6 in favor. Then Drath cast the deciding vote. He voted no. The chamber erupted. Drath adjourned the session. He walked from the chamber and did not stop walking until he reached Sora's confinement room. He dismissed the attendant on duty. He went inside alone. The room was small and lit with the low yellow-white light that the medical division used because studies had shown it was easiest on Drakvori neural systems during rest periods. Sora was at the data terminal. She had been reading. She looked up at him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, which was unusual. He was not someone who stood in doorways. He was someone who entered rooms or did not, and made the decision quickly. He entered. He sat in the only chair in the room, which was not sized for him, and which he sat in anyway without commenting on it. I voted no, he said. She waited. On the rebonding authorization, the council voted to proceed. I voted no. He looked at her. The council's vote required unanimity. It does not proceed. She said nothing for a moment. Then, why? He was quiet for longer than she had ever heard him be quiet in a direct conversation. The bond hum between them was steady and familiar, the old frequency she had lived inside her whole life. But she could feel something different in it, not different like changed, but different like deeper. Like something that had always been there but had not been visible before from where she was standing. When you were given the bond, he said, I gave it to you as an elder gives it, as a structure, a purpose, a direction. That is what the bond is. That is what I understood it to be. He paused. What you have become through whatever has happened in the past months, I did not make that. I cannot find it in any record of the bond system because it did not come from the bond system. He looked at the wall beside her rather than directly at her, which was the Drakvori equivalent of the kind of honesty that is hard to maintain while making full eye contact. And I find that I cannot destroy what I did not make. It would not be correct. Sora held still. Outside the small room, the station continued its orbit. The stars through the observation slit in the upper part of the wall were cold and steady. "You read the archive notation," she said. "It was not a question." "I have always known the notation existed," he said. "I was alive when it was left behind." She looked at him. "Did you ever think about the question it left unanswered?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "a long time ago, and then I stopped." It was, Sora understood, the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and perhaps the most difficult. She did not thank him. She did not know yet what the right response was, and she had learned from Ren that, when you did not know the right response, staying honest was better than filling the silence with something that wasn't true. "I would like to speak to the others," she said. "The hatchlings, not to cause trouble, just to speak." Drath stood from the chair that didn't fit him. He moved toward the door. Before he left, without turning back, he said, "In the morning." The door closed. Sora turned back to the terminal and sat in the quiet. The bond hum was steady, but something in it had a texture it hadn't had before, something she didn't have a word for, and she thought she might not need one. Some things didn't need words. They just needed to be real. And this, finally, was real. News moved through the station in layers. The top layer was official, statements, session records, administrative notices distributed through the formal communication channels in precise, careful language. The middle layer was the kind of thing that attendants told each other in corridor intersections. The bottom layer was what engineers and maintenance workers heard through the data feeds, and the background noise of a station where 1,100 beings lived close together, and information, like heat, tended to distribute itself regardless of whether anyone planned for it. What reached Ren through the bottom layer at the end of the 7th day of Sora's confinement was this. The council had voted to authorize the rebonding procedure. Drath had voted no. The council was reconvening. The rebonding had not happened, but the authorization was still on the table, and a council session had been scheduled in 48 hours to address the deadlock. Ren sat with this information for about 20 minutes. Then he went to find Director Vale. Vale was at her desk doing the administrative equivalent of holding a crumbling wall with both hands and one knee. She had been fielding queries from the Human Interstellar Council since Drath's no vote had leaked through the diplomatic monitoring network. Because Drath's no vote was, as diplomatic events went, the kind of thing that monitoring networks noticed. She looked at Ren when he came in with the expression of someone who had expected him and had been hopping to be wrong. "The Galactic Sentience Accord," Ren said. "Article 31. Vale stared at him. "No sentient being may be subjected to involuntary neurological alteration," he said. "It's the Foundation article. It's been in effect since the Accord was ratified. The Drakvori helped write it." "Ren, the rebonding procedure is a neurological alteration. Sora has not consented to it. She is a sentient being. The Accord applies." Vale was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it took her to run the legal logic herself and arrive at the same destination. Her expression changed, not to agreement exactly, but to the particular look of someone who has found something unexpected in familiar territory and is revising their map. The Accord was never applied to a hatchling. It was never applied to a hatchling because a hatchling never needed it, Ren said. It was written for all sentient beings. That's not a gap in the language. That's the language. Another silence. Vale looked at the wall for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "I'm going to need 3 hours and direct access to the Interstellar Council's legal division. I'll be in the maintenance corridor." "Yes," she said, "I know where to find you." She filed the invocation 8 hours before the 48-hour window closed. She presented it in the reconvened council session the following morning, and she presented it the way that Vale did everything, methodically, completely, without theatrics, letting the language do the work because the language was sufficient. Article 31 of the Galactic Sentience Accord. The Drakvori had co-authored the Accord 3 centuries ago, in a period of interspecies cooperation that everyone in the room had been taught about as a high point of Drakvori statesmanship. The Drakvori signature was on the document. The document said what it said. Koru rose from his seat. He spoke at length and with force, and some of what he said was reasonable and some of it was not, and all of it was too loud, which was how you knew it was coming from a place of reaction rather than thought. The council advisors argued. 2 members of the council attempted to identify a definitional gap in the term sentient being that would exclude hatchlings, and Vale addressed both arguments with the patience of someone who had already anticipated them and prepared accordingly. The 48-hour window closed. The rebonding did not happen. The chamber was quieter after that, not calm exactly, but the kind of quiet that follows when a large thing has come to a stop. Koru walked out before the session formally adjourned. Davin, who had been in the attendance gallery above, watched him go and then looked down at the chamber floor where Vale was gathering her materials, and for a moment his expression was the closest to open that Sora had ever seen it. Sora was released from confinement that same afternoon. Drath came for her himself, without attendance. He walked her from the medical wing to the bond hall, the ceremonial center of hatchling life on the station, where the formal bond rites had been performed, where the affirmations were held, where the history of every bonded line aboard the station was recorded on the interior walls in the old script. It was not a large room. It was a serious one. When they arrived, Koru was not there. Davin was, and 6 other hatchlings stood at various points around the room, young ones, 2 from other bond lines, ones who had received Davin's papers a week ago and had said nothing to anyone and had come here today without being told to, which meant they had decided to come, which was its own kind of answer to a question nobody had formally asked. Drath stood at the front of the room. He looked at all of them, Sara, Davin, the 6 others. He was the same as he always was, the same scale, the same stillness. But something in the room was different, and every hatchling present could feel it. He said, "The bond was given to you. What you do with it from this point is yours." No one spoke. It was not a statement that needed response. It needed space, which is a different thing. Drath held the space for a moment. Then he stepped aside, which was a gesture so simple and so unelder-like that it took Sara a moment to register what he was doing. He was making room. She walked to the center of the hall. She stood where the affirmation circle was marked in the floor. The same place where every hatchling stood during the formal rites. She looked at the walls with their old inscriptions, all those names, all those bond lines, all those entries that ended with a closing notation and a date. She spoke without notes, because she did not need notes. She had been thinking about this for a long time. She said that the bond was real, that she was not standing here to reject it or end it or pretend it had not been what it was. The bond had given her structure and direction when she was young and needed both. She was not going to be dishonest about that. But structure and direction were not the same as the whole of a life, and she had found in the past months that there were things in her that the bond had not made and could not have made, things that had come from reading the messages of a man who answered her questions as if they deserved full answers, and from watching that same man stand in a formal chamber and refuse to become small, and from learning that being seen by something that had no obligation to see you was one of the most significant experiences available to any kind of creature. She said she was not choosing against Sovereign Drath. She was choosing toward truth, toward the hatchlings beside her, toward the principle that what you know about yourself is worth more than the comfort of not knowing it. Then she stopped talking, because she had said what needed to be said. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Davin dipped his head. Then one of the young ones from another bond line dipped his. Then the others, one by one. At the back of the hall there was a doorway that led to the upper observation gallery. Ren was standing in it. He was not in the ceremony. He had not been invited to the ceremony, and he had not invited himself. He had simply known where it would be and had come to stand in the doorway where he could see but was not inside, because that was the right place for him. He was a witness. That was all. That was enough. Sora glanced up and found him there. She dipped her head once, the same small gesture he had given her in a corridor a long time ago, when she had looked back and found someone who had not looked away. He returned it. In the weeks that followed, the station's administrative record changed in ways that were small and significant at the same time. The Drakvori Medical Division opened a formal research inquiry into Bond Drift, not as a corrective project, not as a study of failure, but as a study of the phenomenon itself, what it was and what it meant. 3 other hatchlings across 2 different Drakvori stations submitted formal requests for archive access. The requests were granted, slowly and with conditions, but granted. The Galactic Sentience Accord's Article 31 was suddenly being read very carefully by the legal divisions of 7 different species, who had all apparently realized at roughly the same time that it said what it said, and that this was interesting. Koru requested a transfer to another Elder's Bond line on a station in the outer systems. Drath authorized it without comment. The transfer was processed. Davin was made senior hatchling. Ren Aldrich filed a transfer request, not out of the station, a transfer to a new role, human cultural liaison, a position that had existed on the station's organizational chart as a theoretical appointment for years and had never actually been filled. He filled in the reason field on the official form with 4 words: ongoing cultural consultation, permanent. Vale read the form, made a small sound that was not quite a sigh, approved it, and went back to work. On the evening that the last of the formal proceedings resolved, and the station returned to something that was not quite normal but was at least a different kind of usual, Drath stood at his observation window. It was the same window he had stood at many times, looking at the same stars, the same gas giant below, the same geometry of orbit and gravity that had not changed in all the years he had been stationed here. He was very old. He had stood at this window for a long time. Sora came and stood beside him. She did not announce herself, and he did not tell her to leave. She was no longer coming to him as a hatchling reporting to an elder, not exactly. She was coming as a young mind choosing to stand beside an old one. That was different. Everything about it was different, and yet the room was the same room and the stars were the same stars. They stood in silence for a while. The research team wants to name the phenomenon, Drath said. They are debating what to call it. Sora looked at the stars. What do you think they should call it? Drath was quiet for a moment. I think they should call it what it is, he said. They will resist that. Names like that make things too plain. Sora said nothing. She thought he was right. Below them, somewhere in the maintenance corridors, Ren Aldrich filed his last calibration log of the shift, put his tools away, and walked back to his quarters. He did not hum on the way. He was tired, but he thought about the nod in the corridor, the one that had started everything, and it seemed to him that the entire chain of what had followed was both impossible and completely inevitable, which was how the most important things usually were. He made a note in his personal log that night, which he rarely did. It said only, "Still here. Things that matter deserve a witness. That still seems right." He closed the log and went to sleep. The Drakvori had catalogued 10,000 species across their 3,000 years of expansion. They had recorded biology, language, warfare, migration, extinction, survival. They had entries for every form of life they had encountered and every phenomenon those lives had produced. It was the most comprehensive archive in the known galaxy, and they were justifiably proud of it. but they had never written a single entry on what happens when a creature with nothing to offer and no authority to claim sees another being clearly. Not for strategy, not for benefit, not because the rules require it, and simply decides that what they see deserves to be seen. They would have to write a new entry now. They would have to think carefully about what to call it. They would probably call it something scientific and precise, because that was how they worked, and it would be accurate, and it would miss the point by exactly the margin that clinical language always misses the point of the things that matter most. But the entry would exist, and in a galaxy full of species learning to understand each other, sometimes the entry existing was enough.